All right. I think we can go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us over your lunch hour today during Earth Week. My name is Andrea Lovell. I am the legislative coordinator here at MCEA. MCEA, Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, is a law and science-based advocacy organization working to protect our environment at the courts and at the legislature. So today, I will be moderating our discussion. As we all know, climate change is impacting us in all areas across Minnesota, and Minnesota is a leading emitter of greenhouse gas emissions in the Midwest. So today we're talking about data-driven solutions to avoid the worst impacts of climate change and to be resilient to the impacts that we will see regardless. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Ellen Anderson, Dr. Melissa Partin, and Aubrey Arkman, and our special guest Dr. Knuth, to give us some expert insight. Just as a brief preview into the structure of how this webinar will go today, we'll start with our panelists with some content that they've prepared for us today, and then we'll take some time to answer questions from you all. During the presentation, please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to as many as we are able to. We do have a lot of folks registered for this, so we may not get to all of the questions, but we will do our best. So with that, let's start with some introductions. Can I hand it to you, Ellen?
Sure. Good to be here this morning on Earth Week. And I have to say, as a young girl, I was inspired by the very first Earth Day back in 1970. And it helped me get on the path that I've gone on ever since. And the career path that I took was then from a young attorney to serving in the legislature for 18 years and passing some of our clean energy laws at that time, chairing the Public Utilities Commission, working for former Governor Dayton, and then I ran a program at the University of Minnesota called the Energy Transition Lab, and I've been really happy to be working at MCEA for the last 2 years.
Awesome. I'll hand it over to Melissa.
Hi, everyone. Melissa Partin. I joined MCEA as a climate policy analyst this fall to provide analytic support for our climate program priorities. And I was trained as a social epidemiologist. And before jumping into the climate policy arena, I worked for many years doing public health research at the university and the Minneapolis Veterans Affairs Hospital. So I bring that research expertise to the work I do for MCEA. And one of the things I've been working on at MCEA is driving greenhouse gas reduction potential estimates for some of the climate solutions we might want to support. And I'm really happy to be here today.
And Kate.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kate Knuth, and really excited to be with the MCEA team today. I bring a set of experiences working on climate in multiple different sectors. I served with then Senator Anderson as a state representative, and we worked on climate policy and clean energy policy together. I built and led a leadership program at the University of Minnesota's Institute on the Environment, was our City of Minneapolis first chief resilience officer. And for the last few years have been building a climate policy and strategy consulting business called Democracy and Climate, and really excited about some of the white papers I've had the chance to work on with the 100% campaign, helping to push climate adaptation policy and approaches here in the state, in addition to the really super important reducing emissions work that so many are also focused on. Thanks.
And Aubrey.
Hi, it's great to be here with all of you today. My name is Aubrey Arkman. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a senior at Central High School and currently a legislative intern here at MCEA. I've done work both in the legislature and in the organizing world, working as the chair of the Minnesota Youth Council Committee on Environmental Justice, helping represent sort of the positions and priorities of young people to our elected officials, state agencies, and governor's office, as well as working to organize young people in schools across our state and across the Twin Cities, helping teach students how to advocate for themselves and how to build smart, strong, community-centered change. And I'm here to provide some new perspectives on how we can focus on environmental justice and data in our climate plans and center young people, communities of color, and low-income communities. So it's really great to be here.
Awesome. Thanks for your introductions, everybody. So we'll go ahead and get started. We're going to start with Ellen. And Ellen, what is the state of climate in Minnesota?
State of climate. Well, as you said, Andrea, at the starting point, Minnesota plays a critical role in climate change. We're part of the Midwest. The Midwest is one of the biggest emitters and has a huge impact on emissions for the whole country. So the United States will never meet climate targets without progress from the Midwest and Minnesota in particular. And as you might know, Minnesota is already experiencing climate change now. It's here now. We are actually the fastest warming state in the nation, especially for winter temperatures. And we've all seen and experienced extreme weather events, floods, hotter summers, wildfires. And we know that just our everyday usage of fossil fuels is something that we experience every day, and we breathe polluted air. And we know also that this kind of air pollution that's coming from fossil fuel usage disproportionately impacts communities of color and low-income communities and causes different kinds of respiratory diseases, asthma, et cetera. So we have a lot to do, but tackling climate change, it's not just bad news. It's not just doom and gloom. We know what to do about it. We know how to do it. We have the tools. And so what are we doing about it in Minnesota? So briefly, I'll say, so in 2007, we passed a law, the Next Generation Energy Act, that said that we had to cut emissions across all sectors of the economy by separate dates, 2015, 2025, and 2050. And unfortunately, we haven't met those targets, and we're not on track to meet those targets. So we have this, but it's not enough. And that law said we have to go across all sectors of the economy: transportation, agriculture, buildings, industry, et cetera. And so we still need to figure that out. But the latest science is even more urgent in terms of what we have to do. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the international body of the world's leading scientists. And they have made it clear that what we have to do now is to reduce emissions in half this decade. That means 8 years from now, we need to be half where we are now in terms of carbon emissions. And that means we have to start right now. So I want to say just a few of the key things that we need to have a data-driven and equitable plan of action. I have my 4 top things that I think we should do as a state and that experts say are needed to make progress on cutting carbon and having a carbon-free future. First of all, we have to clean the electric grid. We have to have clean electricity. We have to power it as much as we can with wind and solar energy and clean renewables and other carbon-free sources, which are now cheaper than fossil fuels. So we're making progress on that, which is really important. The other thing we need to do is take that clean electricity and apply it to other sectors. That's why electric vehicles matter, electricity in industry, making our homes more dependent on electricity instead of burning natural gas in our kitchens, which then we breathe that toxic gas. So electrify as much as we can, stop wasting energy and being more energy efficient so that we have more comfortable homes and we save money. And finally, we have to phase out fossil fuels, and we can't build new fossil fuel plants. And of course, those other sectors we have to do as well. And all of these things have to be done in an equitable and accessible way. So we have to ensure that everybody in Minnesota can have an opportunity to benefit from the clean energy future, and we can avoid the worst impacts that some people are experiencing due to inequities. So the last thing I would say is that really, if we do this right, if we provide accessible and equitable climate solutions in Minnesota, it means we're going to have cleaner air to breathe. We're going to have a better quality of life. We're going to have more efficient vehicles and homes. And we're going to have cleaner air. So our future actually looks brighter when we tackle climate change. So I'll stop there and look forward to more conversation about this.
Thanks, Ellen. That was a good overview of what a good climate plan would look like for Minnesota and what some of those components might be. I'd like to hand it over to Melissa to talk a little bit about what the tools look like to come up with a good climate plan and what we mean by data-driven.
Sure. So a data-driven climate plan could rely on several essential tools to clarify where we are now, where we need to get to, how we get there, and how we're doing. So to determine where we are now, we need a valid and up-to-date source of information on greenhouse gas emissions, and we can get that from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency website. To determine where we need to get to, we need the most up-to-date science on what our emission reduction targets should be to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And as Ellen mentioned, the IPCC has provided those targets for us. We need to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030 and get to net zero by 2050. To determine how we get there, we need to use a data-driven approach to identify policy solutions that can add up to achieve our emission reduction targets, document how those solutions might impact other outcomes that matter, like jobs and public health, and then shape and prioritize those solutions with input from all parties who have a stake in the plan. In terms of how we're doing, a solid climate plan would specify quantifiable metrics of success that can be tracked. So for example, if one of your policies is to reduce energy waste in buildings, you might want to specify and track the number of existing inefficient buildings that are retrofitted by a given date. So a lot of a data-driven approach relies on numbers, quantifiable data, like estimating emissions and the impact of the policies on those and other outcomes. But deciding how to shape and prioritize solutions relies on words or qualitative data, so the perspectives and observations and experiences of stakeholders. So a good data-driven climate plan relies on both qualitative and quantitative data.
Yeah, thank you for that, Melissa. So how can we incorporate this into a climate plan for Minnesota? How do we do that?
Sure. So my work at MCEA related to this has focused on documenting those emission reductions and sort of the potential of that associated with different climate policy solutions. So I'm going to focus on how to incorporate that into a climate plan. And as I mentioned, every good climate plan should model how the policies prioritized can add up to achieve emission targets. The specific type of model or tool that you use to see if you're achieving that should be tailored to your goals. So if your goal is to explore relative impacts of different types of policies on emissions, simulation model is a good place to start. These are the simplest types of models and don't require a lot of computing power to use. But if you want to identify the best set of policies for achieving emission targets while also maximizing other outcomes like costs or jobs, you'd want an optimization model. And those are more complex and require a lot of expertise and computing power to use. A good climate plan might rely on both types of modeling, but I'd say at a minimum, you want to use a simulation model to demonstrate how your policies can add up to achieve your emission targets. At MCEA, we've been using a simulation model called the Energy Policy Simulator to explore the impact of different policy solutions. And this is an online tool that allows you to specify different levels of ambition for a wide range of common climate mitigation policies in every sector. And then you can examine how those choices impact emissions and other outcomes. And we selected this tool because it was developed by modelers we trust to be rigorous, Rocky Mountain Institute and Energy Innovation. It relies on the most recent data, which is important because these energy models, the inputs for them can change dramatically over time. And it allows for cross-sector analysis, meaning you can look at different policy mixes across sectors and explore their impacts and other outcomes. And it derives those estimates in a way that avoids double counting. It's also open source, which means it's free to us. We can download the raw data and graphs for our own purposes, and it relies on data that's specific to Minnesota. This is really important because the impact of climate solutions can really vary across regions, depending on local energy profiles, markets, industries, and demographics. So for a Minnesota plan, we need Minnesota data. And we're not the only ones that are using this tool. The Walz administration used it to quantify the impact of some of the solutions in their climate action framework. And we know at least 2 other states are also using it to inform their climate plans.
So what does the data say from this tool? What are some of the things that we could enact in Minnesota that would be effective solutions?
So yeah, great question. As Ellen alluded to, one of the things, and not just from this tool, but from other national models and other local models, we know that achieving the reductions that we need to preserve a livable planet, avoid the worst impacts of climate change are, it's achievable, it's affordable. We have the technology now to meet our 2030 targets, and it's not going to break the bank to deploy them. Primarily because clean sources of power like wind and solar have become so cheap. And in terms of how specifically we get there, a consistent finding across regions and models and data sources is that solutions with the greatest impact on emissions involve cleaning up the grid, as Ellen mentioned, electrifying end uses as much as possible, and minimizing emissions from agriculture and land use. We also know that solutions that hit people where they live, like reducing energy waste in our homes and electrifying how we heat and cool and cook in them, can reduce energy burden and improve health, benefits that are particularly critical for low-income residents. So those are just some broad brushstroke kind of consistent findings, what we're seeing in this tool we're using, but also others have documented in local and national studies of climate solution impacts.
So Kate, is this something that Minnesota is doing?
That's a big question. I think we've heard great descriptions of how to think about this big comprehensive problem overall. And I think one of the exciting things and also one of the challenges that I have found working in the climate space in the last few years is thinking about how to get carbon literally out of every single piece of how we do things and actually doing things better, like cooking. I love cooking with my induction stove, for example, better. I love driving my electric vehicle, and I love taking a bike if my husband is using our one car. So I think we are, and we also have more to do. And one of the things that I wanted to remind people today is that one of the things we know about climate change is that more emissions reductions sooner have better long-term climate impacts. Like, it's a bigger deal to reduce a ton of carbon now than a ton of carbon in a decade from now. And so I think at a very high level, this knowledge that reducing emissions now in the moment we're in will have ongoing benefits for years and the rest of humanity, quite literally, is something that I think it's important when we think about data driven, and that maybe data driven isn't always perfect when it hits the realities. I think Melissa mentioned that idea of qualitative data, and right now we're in a really important moment in Minnesota in terms of the potential to invest significantly in climate solutions in our state. We have over a $9 billion state budget surplus. And it's important to note that that surplus in part comes because we count inflation on the revenue side, but not on the what we spend it on side, what the expenditure side. But still, we have significant state money that we can invest in making our state's future better. And I think climate solutions are a really important place to be investing that parts of that budget surplus. So the state house has moved significant pieces of investing in climate solutions as part of their budget bills. Governor Walz has put significant climate solutions in his budget proposals. So I think we need to pressure the Senate and we need to make sure that Governor Walz has climate solutions and investing in them with the state budget surplus as a key part of his end of session budget negotiations. So what do those actually look like? I think some key ones I want to highlight for this group are the weatherization. We know that weatherizing homes is both a cost-effective and an equitable climate solution because households that are eligible for weatherization to reduce the energy cost burden for these families are really they're targeted based on folks who are eligible for heating assistance, who are eligible for energy assistance. So it's already targeted to have higher impact. Investing in bus rapid transit infrastructure helps us build out a transit system and also makes it more accessible to get around for people who may or may not be able to afford a car. There's also significant investments in active transportation, so getting people out of cars when they don't need to be in them. Electrification, I think, as both Ellen and Melissa talked about, are really important. There's an exciting bill that includes updating electrical outlets and boards within people's homes so they can actually plug stuff in, and electrifying school buses as a way to push on the technology and reduce the kind of things kids are breathing in. So I think it's just really exciting that we have, at this moment, we need to be acting big on climate. We have an opportunity to make significant investments with our state tax dollars to make that future better for immediate needs and better for the long terms in terms of climate change impacts. You're on mute.
Of course I am.
Yeah.
I had the chat box up to look at some questions and it was blocking my button. But thank you for all of that insight. That's really helpful. I wonder if we could move to talk a little bit more about the qualitative data as part of this impact. Audrey, can you talk a little bit about how data-driven solutions also include qualitative data?
Yeah, and I think when we're thinking about data, we really want to paint with a broad brush, understanding that data-driven solutions are dependent on that hard data that Melissa's talking about in terms of our numbers and our raw data, but it also includes talking to stakeholders and ensuring that we're taking into account the information that we're given from people that are living in communities, people that are being impacted by our changes. And I think it's an especially important tool when talking about environmental justice, because qualitative data can tell us which areas and problems we want to focus our climate solutions on. But furthermore, qualitative data allows us to recognize where gaps may exist inside our proposed solutions. And that's because it allows people to step up and sort of say what's impacting them. And then we can amend to make sure our changes are equitable. By studying our history, from hearing what different people are saying, we can understand which solutions have historically worked for low-income communities and communities of color. And we can understand with more nuance the ways that our climate policy and plan will impact communities of color, low-income communities, and young people. So especially when we're talking about data, I think it's really important to recognize that qualitative data, whether that is surveying people, whether that is understanding the history of our state, whether that's directly interacting with stakeholders, plays just as an important role as quantitative data when developing our climate plans and solutions.
Yeah. So what's an example of that? So what can we take as an example of something that is a data-driven solution that impacts these communities who are lower income or BIPOC communities?
Yeah, so I think what's most important is to understand that the concept of environmental justice is entirely backed by data. And starting just with definitions, we understand that environmental justice is focusing on which communities are more vulnerable, and that is dependent on our data, whether it's discovering which communities are more at risk through demographic analysis, understanding where we have language barriers, communities of color, and low-income communities, understanding where pre-pollution impacts are already largest, where air quality is worse, where we find that there is more flooding, or areas where we find are already dealing with the impacts of climate change the most, where urban heat island effect is the highest, where energy burden is the highest. So data plays a really important role in setting the groundwork for understanding the disparities. And from there, data plays an important role in tracking how those disparities change throughout our solutions. I think one of the things we don't talk about is how climate plans need to adapt as they move forward. And that involves data and that involves environmental justice. We can't just make a plan and assume that it's going to work perfectly. We have to make sure we're monitoring for those disparities. And the way we do that is through data. And I think understanding and interweaving that through our climate plans and understanding that there needs to be a process for taking this qualitative data we get from people, the quantitative data from understanding disparities, and continuing to adapt and amend our climate policy is how we deliver not only for our white and wealthy communities, but deliver for our low income and communities of color across our state.
I think that was really well said and kind of helps us with a thorough line of all of these different panelists here. So thank you for that. I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about what people can do to support data-driven solutions.
Yeah. And again, when we talk about data and when we talk about solutions, we really want to paint with a big brush. And I think the same thing is true for personal action. One of the big things, and Kate already touched on this, is to get in contact with your legislators. We're right now in the middle of a really, really important legislative session, and there are vital pieces of legislation moving through the House in relation to environment and natural resources and climate and energy. These omnibus packages don't do everything we need to do, but they're a start. And if we don't get them passed, and if we don't get a start in reducing our emissions and necessary climate programs now, we have no chance of reaching the necessary targets by 2030. But furthermore, there's solutions that have come outside of the legislative process that I think everyone can attach to more quickly. The first is focusing and making sure that you're aware of what is happening and staying educated on what is happening inside of climate plans. When climate plans are released, we should ensure that they target our most important sectors, are founded in expert data and research, and that they take into account the most important stakeholders, especially low-income communities and communities of color. All the things that different panelists have talked about today, from Ellen to Melissa to Kate, are things that we need to look at and stay educated about when we're reading possible solutions and proposed plans. Because if we're not educated and we aren't pushing people to press data-driven solutions and we aren't checking people to make sure they're interacting with stakeholders, our climate plans are not going to be as successful as they need to be. And the final thing is to recognize that change can happen inside community. And as important as it is to pressure your legislators, it's also important to uplift what's happening in your community, whether it's groups creating small community gardens, whether it's student groups leading movements to lower recycling and decarbonize their schools, whether it's just your neighbor wanting to learn more about what is happening in terms of climate policy and climate change. Every small step we take in our personal lives, every small step we take to uplift our community, to educate our community, really plays a really big role as much as it plays in the legislative process. So all these different things, whether it's contacting your legislators, whether it's staying educated, whether it's working with your community, all can lead to sort of the necessary change we need to truly transition our relationship with our natural environment, and especially transition that relationship for young people, low-income people, and communities of color.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with all that. I know that part of my work is partly at home. You know, I talk to my own family about this data that I see every single day, and that's just part of the job. So we certainly encourage everyone to have those kinds of conversations in every part of your life. So I'd like to move to some of the questions. There have been a number of questions put into the Q&A that I think are really good questions that I would love to have us start tackling. So I want to start with a question that I think Ellen will be able to address the best. And that is what makes Minnesota a top emitter in the Midwest, and what does that look like? What are the things that make us a higher emitter than other states?
So I would say that, you know, Minnesota is actually making some good progress when it comes to reducing emissions from the electricity sector, as I mentioned before. And we advocates, environmental advocates, citizens, all kinds of people have advocated very hard to set deadlines to retire all and close down all of our coal plants in the state of Minnesota. So in that regard, we've been really successful, I would say, and almost all well, there's still one remaining coal plant that does not have a date to retire before 2030, but the rest are there, and we're working on the one up in northern Minnesota that we would like to retire as soon as we can, because that's a huge impact. And that in that regard, I think we're doing better than some other parts of the Midwest, than other Midwestern states. I would say in some other areas, we have a challenge, and we've talked about the fact that we haven't met our targets that we have in law, and in the agricultural sector, in the building sector, and in industry and transportation. You know, we've often throughout the last few years seen increases in emissions rather than reductions in many of these sectors. So we know we have a lot of work to do in all of those areas. I would tend to look at it more as a regional issue, and because we are part of a regional grid. Our electricity grid covers many states around us. And so when you really look at the Midwest, that's where you can see overall that we have a big impact as emitters. So I have seen data that said that if the Midwest states were a country, they would be one of the biggest emitting countries in the world, in the top 10. And so that tells you that all the states combined around the Midwest have a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, whether from coal, from gas, and from agriculture. I would say those are some of the big ones, in transportation. So it would be great if we could work with some of our neighboring states to try to do climate plans that we can, and climate solutions together, because, you know, the emissions don't end at the border. You know, even if we do a good job of cutting our electricity sector emissions, we still have electricity coming in from the region that is sometimes used in Minnesota imports. So we really need to focus on the whole area, the whole region, to be successful in climate actions. And, you know, I'll just say one more thing. The state of Illinois just passed a really ambitious climate law that embeds equity very deeply in every aspect of what they do, and puts some strong targets into place. So there's a lot of potential there.
Anybody else want to add anything to that about Minnesota being a large emitter? No, okay. So Ellen, you did touch on something in what you were saying that was also asked a lot in the questions. Can you talk, or can anybody talk a little bit more about the impact of the agricultural sector and what are some solution ideas for how to address the fact that the agricultural sector is one of the largest emitters?
Yeah, I could start, but I think others on this panel could fill in and know at least as much as I do. But yeah, we know that the agricultural sector those emissions have been growing. And that's a big challenge, because we don't have the policy frameworks like we do in the electricity sector that regulates the electric utilities and says, hey, you got to cut emissions. There is no such thing in the agricultural sector. There's no laws that say they have to cut emissions. So that's a challenge. And I think we have seen so much work done, for example, at the University of Minnesota, that is exploring and finding and testing all kinds of different ways that farmers can reduce their emissions by using different farming practices, cover crops, and many other ways that they can do that if they're crop producers. And then there are even some ways that you can reduce emissions from cows and hogs. And, you know, some of it could be in their diet. I've even seen experiments that say if you can go to the beef cows and put masks, they have these special masks they can use that help them release less emissions. Now, that's not really taking off at a large scale yet, but we need to look at all the different ways that we can figure out how farming can get there. And I think there's a lot of farmers that really are interested in cutting emissions. And so any support that and incentives for that will be great. But then there's other farmers that don't want to change their practices. And so that's a challenge that we have to address. And then the last thing I would say about agriculture is that it's a huge source, potentially, the natural lands and the forests of carbon sequestration in the ground. And so being able to have practices that support the soils and the water around them is really important, and sequestering the carbon in those lands is going to be another important part of climate solutions. So I don't know, who would like to jump in and add to that?
I would, if I could add something here too, in terms of agricultural climate solutions. There's some really great investments that the House has put forward here too, with the Forever Green initiative, with planting a tree for every Minnesotan every year for the next few years, and funding to do some of these nature-based solutions for climate change. And the other piece I wanted to add in terms of agriculture is a place where we really need to be paying attention to how climate change impacts are unfolding and how they're affecting farmers' abilities to take care of crops effectively in terms of drought, in terms of flooding, in terms of when the rain is coming, making sure that folks in the forest products industry are planning for a climate that's 30 years out as they're planting trees that'll be harvested in years to come. And this is a place where with the 100% campaign that I've been partnering with, we've been really trying to help make sense of where Minnesota is on climate adaptation and resilience. As I said, we need to absolutely reduce emissions as quickly and equitably as we can. And we also have data about how climate change impacts are already affecting our state and our infrastructure and in our agriculture and our forest industries. And we need to be using that data both about historic climate impacts and projection of climate impacts going forward to make smart investments in our infrastructure and in our agricultural and forestry practices. So it's another piece of the massive climate puzzle and a place where folks can plug in as well.
Yeah, I'd like to add just one last thing to what both of you are saying, and that is that at MCEA and then other organizations that we partner with, we're looking at agricultural practices and which ones have some higher impact for climate results. So we've supported in the last couple of years the soil health program that was authored by Representative Lippert and I think was driven a lot by Land Stewardship Project. And we are also involved in water quality issues regarding agriculture that also have an impact on climate change and climate resiliency. So, I would say that we are working on getting into that data to figure out what are the best policy solutions in the agricultural sector that will make the highest impact. So, and I think all of those are things that were alluded to. Ellen, did you want to say something?
Can I just add one more example? Yeah. Thank you for those great examples, but I would be amiss if I didn't include this, that MCEA has really led the charge when there's big new proposals for big new farming operations that we have created. MCEA attorneys have fought hard to get a legal requirement that says that you have to, an environmental review process before you build a project like that, you have to document what the greenhouse gas emissions impacts will be. And that was never done before. And before we litigated that. And so we've been working with state agencies and to make sure that that becomes, a regular practice across the state, that when, there's a proposal, it's not just going to look at, what happens with with a lot of cows, but what happens with the electricity, what happens with the water, what are the environmental impacts and what are the greenhouse gas emissions impacts before you build another big project that could have serious environmental impacts.
Yeah, thanks for adding that. That is a really important thing that I missed in my little addition here. So thank you. There is another question that I think is a really challenging one. So I'm hoping that a few people can jump in on that. But who is accountable for the targets that were set and that we missed? Who's responsible for that, and how are we keeping them accountable?
I don't want to hog it, but I'll say something. And so when we passed the Next Generation Energy Act, it was very clear in 2007 that these targets had to happen. And there was language put in the bill that basically said, this is the goal of the state, it's in the law, but there was not really, and there was an implementation plan that sort of is now way out of date, and it's not really binding anymore. So we tried, MCEA's worked with legislators in the House of Representatives this past year to develop a new piece of legislation called the Next Generation Climate Act, which would update the science for those climate targets and would put accountability in to say that the state agencies are responsible for this. They are responsible to make sure that these targets are met. So that has passed the House of Representatives. We have yet to get a hearing on it in the Senate. So that's a place where people's voices would make a really big difference, because we definitely need that accountability.
I think there's an important point too about how do we hold people accountable for not prioritizing climate investments and data-driven solutions. And I think we go quickly to the idea of, especially for our legislators, we could vote them out, which is, of course, electoral pressure works. But I think there's more to be said about the role that we have in sort of educating our communities to stand up for these issues. And that's how we really build pressure and build a movement, is by sort of pushing the people in power to do things not just through electoral fright, but through constant pressure on them and constant understanding that they're doing something wrong. Whether it's working to educate our young people on how to become better citizens and better advocates for climate issues to continually to put pressure on people, whether it's educating our neighbors and whether it's educating our unaware community members. We really need to be able to build a long-term movement when it comes to climate change issues. And especially right now, some of the ways that we hold people accountable have to be through understanding the role that a community plays in understanding that. So not just through sort of the electoral process that we know well and truly can hold people accountable, but understanding that before we really can hold someone accountable, we have to have community backing for those issues. And I think that's an important thing that we often miss in that area.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that you've sort of hit the nail on the head when it comes to what's frustrating about the process, right? I've seen a lot of questions in the chat that have come up to say, why hasn't the legislature done this? And, what are the barriers to getting this done? And to be perfectly honest, we're working in a really challenging system. We have the only divided legislature in the country, in the state of Minnesota. And that just leads to a lot of roadblocks. And the legislation process is already one that is slow intentionally. And then we're also dealing with a lot of other, factors in how our legislation currently works, with the polarization of our politics and whatnot that make it even harder to make things through, to get things through. Even things that have bipartisan support are hard to push through the legislature right now. So, it is a question that is both, what do we do to keep people accountable? And also, how do we get things moving that are really important? And they're really related questions that are incredibly challenging. So, we don't have a clear-cut answer for you on that, but they're related, and those are really difficult things that we're working to address. And we're doing the best we can to push through things at the legislature and keep folks accountable. And some of that has to do with you all. So our action alerts help keep people accountable. You being involved in organizations like MCEA and others, that all really helps keeping the pressure and keeping folks accountable.
And I would just point to Kate and say, Kate, you should talk about all the cities that you know of that you've worked with, and what you were talking about, Audrey, that what happens at the local level is just as important as what happens at the state level. It really takes all of those things. And so there's, yeah.
Yeah, in terms of the accountability here, I think there's not one person we point to who is accountable for the Next Generation Energy Act targets. I want our legislature and our governor to be more accountable than they have been. And I think it's really problematic that we don't have clearer accountabilities. But I want to take a step even further back and look at some of the concerns I have and many have about our democracy overall and the role of making sure that people understand how to be active and engaged participants in our democracy as residents and citizens, making sure that we're clear about how money is playing roles in our politics in terms of elections and in terms of lobbying, and making sure we have a strong democracy that helps us do the kind of work we need to do together. And so it might seem a little weird to talk about democracy in a climate webinar, but I think making sure that we have strong voter access, that people have the skills and abilities and institutions to be effective at engaging with each other and with community groups in our government, I think is really important. And, you know, I see the comment up here about we have a plan and that makes us feel better, but we haven't actually met the plan. And are we doing another plan now? And that part of that is why I started with pushing for this moment where we have the opportunity to make significant investments with a state budget surplus. And I think those investments paired with the requirements to move towards clean energy, the requirements to move towards electrification, the requirements to have cleaner cars, as Governor Walz has pushed, that investment combined with the requiring that we reduce emissions through state policy changes and local policy changes, I think how we achieve the emissions we're going after. And at the local level, you know, I just worked on a paper with the 100% campaign about city climate action plans. City climate action work happens in multiple different places: comprehensive plans, climate action plans, sustainability plans. And it's a way that people can be engaged at the most local level, in a level of government that has really important climate decision-making around density, around parking, around land use planning, around how our buildings operate. Although state has significant influence there in terms of how our buildings operate. And I think at the local level is where people can really step up and be clear about that accountability. I'll give a really important example happening right now in the Twin Cities. So Minneapolis has a really strong transportation action plan at the local level. It was passed with all but one of our city council voting for it. And right now it's being tested in implementation with Hennepin Avenue rebuild. This is very down low. This is very local. But if we don't, this is one of the big tests of, are we actually going to do what our plan says to try to get people out of cars, to make it easier to live life without having to drive a car, and to be able to have it safe and easy to walk, bike, and take transit. And that's that if you live in Minneapolis, you've probably seen a lot of fights around this. It's because that's where the rubber hits the road, quite literally, the implementation of some of these plans. And we as residents and citizens have to be clear that we expect not just good plans, but implementation of those plans. And that's where part of the accountability comes as well.
And I just want to further what Kate said. And another really great example of this is over in St. Paul. St. Paul had a developed climate action and resilience plan, but a couple voices stood up and worried about the environmental justice impacts of that plan. And they sent emails and they went to board meetings. And in a year, we created the St. Paul Climate Justice Advisory Board, just another added layer of local sort of power and influence to sort of understand how the climate plans and policies will impact St. Paul's communities of color and low-income communities. And so while there's a lot of gridlock, like Andrea said, at the high up level of our legislature, once we start going down, there's a lot of change that can happen in local areas. And in those areas, people's voices have a much bigger impact. Not a lot of city councilors are being harassed every day about their role in greenhouse gas emissions and in climate policy. And I think that's something that we need to do more, because cities have a really big role in reducing emissions and especially impacting the lives of their most vulnerable residents. And I also want to touch on sort of what Kate said about democracy, because I think we can realize there are larger systematic problems that inhibit our ability to focus on climate change. And especially for communities of color, for low-income communities, and for young communities, I think there's this idea that climate sits independent from issues of justice, issues of housing, issues of racial inequity is a really bad concept, because we understand that when we reduce racial inequity, we improve our carbon emissions. When we focus on health impacts, that also impacts our carbon emissions. When we focus on economic impacts, that also impacts our carbon emissions. So there are a lot of things we can do to shift our systems, whether it's through democracy programs, whether it's through our justice programs, that can also impact our carbon emissions at a very local level. And I think oftentimes we get hung up in that climate policy won't pass at the legislature. And we can look outside of that and say, we can focus on transportation policy that then impacts climate policy, or economic policy that then impacts climate policy. We can be creative about our solutions by understanding the intersections and also understanding the roles that different communities can play in this crisis.
I think that's very well said, Audrey. I think it really speaks volumes to me, and kind of leads me into the next question, which is, how do we support all of this climate planning for folks who are low income? I've seen this in the Q&A as well of, how do we get folks who are in low income communities to switch to electric cars, for example, or to get the gas appliances out of their apartments? What can we do to support those people? And that can be for anybody. It doesn't have to be Audrey.
Well, I'll start and then I can let some others jump in. I think that's a really important question. And I think the first thing I think about a lot is, what are communities of color and low income communities focused on? And often the biggest issue isn't an issue with climate change. And I think that's a really hard thing for a lot of us that are so focused on climate change as our number one issue to think about, is that in these communities, that's not their number one priority, whether it's gun violence, whether it's education, whether it's economic disparities. Again, when people aren't focusing on climate change, it's really hard to convince them that the most important thing for them to do right now is focus on weatherization for their house or focus on switching their appliances. So again, that goes back to the idea of understanding the intersections between different sectors. One thing that comes immediately to my mind is food insecurity is a really big issue. And we also know that in places that are food deserts, people oftentimes are forced into using processed food, which is usually in plastic packaging, comes in a lot, it creates a lot of waste in general. So by focusing on issues like community food gardens, we can not only tackle someone's number one issue, which is food insecurity, and ensuring that we have a healthy and nutritious diet for people, especially for children and families. But that reduces our waste and reduces our consumption, which is a really big thing. And we can see that in tons of different sectors. But furthermore, we have to also understand the role that education and government programs can play in this. And I think this also goes into what Kate was saying about the role of cities. But if people don't know that they are able to have we talk about weatherization and making homes more energy efficient, there are programs at the city level to help low-income residents with those things. And without community education, without people understanding that they have that ability, they're not going to be able to reach out. And we know cities are scrapped, and we know that local governments don't have the time or funding to go and contact every single low-income resident and ensure that they have the right access to programs. So we really need to be able to stand up and see what we can do as a local community to educate people on the opportunities that they have. And that starts in our communities. It starts in our schools even further. By educating people about the opportunities they have in their school buildings, we take a really big role in moving forward the progress for families and for low-income communities. So I think Kate, Ellen, there's some stuff for you to touch on there, and I'll pass it off.
Yeah, I would just throw in one thought, which is, when we talk about climate solutions, we need to be super cognizant of the impacts that are so different depending on who the audience is and who you're talking about. So electric vehicles being a perfect example. There's lots of people who are excited about their electric vehicles. Kate is, I am, and that's great because we can afford to buy one. But if we start putting charging stations in, low-income neighborhoods, it doesn't mean that people who live in that neighborhood can afford to buy an electric car. And so we need to rethink how this kind of policy can be scaled to a broader place, and how it can, bring everybody along. Like, for example, maybe car sharing would be a good option to offer. But again, as you've made really clear, Audrey, you need to listen to the voices of people in communities and find out what could be a benefit if it was available and easily accessible.
Right, and I would just add to what Ellen said that it's not just electric vehicles and induction stoves, it's electric public transit and school buses, solar on schools, programs that target rental property and create incentives and deep subsidies and rebates for rental property owners to benefit renters and make rental property homes healthier for the residents, like offering subsidies for switching to induction stoves that would benefit the renters in low-income areas, or in hotspots for asthma hospitalizations, for instance. So it's not just electric cars and induction stoves for the people who can afford them.
Yeah, I think that there was one question that came in the chat that I think is a good note to end on. And that is, how we can educate us until we're blue in the face, but how do we change the hearts? Because that's where a lot of the problems are. And I couldn't agree more with that. We have to make some people actually care about climate change in order to make things happen. And I would just say that, part of what this plan is, or what we're trying to create a plan on, is to aim at things that people care about, because that's how you get everybody on board. So for example, if there's, an area where you have an uncle who likes to hunt, and then, all of a sudden there is nothing to hunt there anymore. That can be a problem. I live next to Como Lake. Como Lake is incredibly polluted, and it does not freeze over entirely anymore because of pollution. And so we have a lot of problems there. And, I would love to have it a lake where we could actually recreate in, as opposed to just walking around it next to me. And that's something I care about. There's something there for everybody that you care about. So I would start with,
add one
Please.
thing in terms of hearts and minds. I would also say it's really important for us who are on the choir that we are singing together and pushing hard together. Being very honest, my heart and mind right now is tired and frustrated a lot of the time. And I think we recognize that we are fighting an essential fight for each other, for our kids, for our planet, for the quality of life of people everywhere. And so I think part of it is us staying in this work, even and especially when it's hard, and knowing that fighting to change over an energy system and fighting to change over how we power things, people who interests that are very entrenched for good reasons because of how our system's set up and capital accumulation and fossil fuel wealth. It's important to support and back up the work each person is doing to try to build that future that we're envisioning together, and bringing more people on board, yes, and helping us push stronger, because it's a fight. It's not like if it was all easy and we could all do it pretty simply, I think it would have happened already. So I think one of the things that's really important climate work to me is finding my community of fellow climate champions to do the work together. And I think MCEA is one of the great organizations where folks can find that among many others in our community that we're blessed to have. So I just wanted to add that as how important it is to do this work with and for others.
Yeah, thanks for that addition. I appreciate that. And I agree. There are lots of organizations, including MCEA, doing the good work. So we appreciate everybody who came here today to listen to what we have to say and to participate in coming up with a good climate plan for our state. I wanted to take just a minute to thank all the panelists for a great conversation today. and to thank everybody for your amazing, thoughtful questions. There were so many that we did not get to because we are so strapped for time. But we really appreciate all of the questions that you sent in, and I did read all of them and tried to get to as many as we could. So thank you for that. You'll get a follow-up email with the recording of this webinar and our action alerts to act on climate. So I think that has already been put in the chat, but you'll get that via email as well. And you'll get some information about our upcoming webinars for the legislative session as well. Our next one is on May 3rd, and it's talking about defense at the legislature. So it's going to be another really hot webinar issue to talk about. So I hope you all can join us for that as well. Thanks again for your time, everyone. Have a great afternoon and a meaningful Earth Week.
Thank you all.